Hello and welcome. Find your way to a place of warmth, of comfort, and of quiet. Let the world outside this moment begin to fade, its sharp edges blurring into a gentle haze. We are about to embark on a long and profound journey, not across continents or through the annals of great kings, but into the very heart of the deepest, darkest season of the medieval world. We are going to the winter. We believe we understand winter. We know its chill, its early nights, its festive lights. Our winter is a season of managed comfort, a time defined by thermostats, by grocery stores brimming with the produce of distant summers, by the warm, secure bubble of modern life. Our relationship with winter is one of control, of insulation. It is a picturesque inconvenience, but the winter we will enter tonight is a different entity entirely. For the medieval peasant, the vast majority of the population, winter was not a season to be enjoyed. It was a foe, a siege engine of immense and patient power. It was a slow, creeping war, fought on a dozen fronts simultaneously. It was a battle against the insidious, bone-stealing cold. It was a long campaign against the gnawing, hollowing emptiness of starvation. It was a psychological war against the crushing, impenetrable totality of the darkness. And it was a spiritual war against the quiet, creeping despair that the cold and the dark brought with them. To see the first thaw of spring was not a simple turning of the calendar. It was a victory. It was the survival of a long and brutal siege. Over the next 10 hours, we will attempt to understand the totality of that struggle. We will strip away the insulation of our own time and step into the frozen, muddy reality of the peasant's life. We will feel, in our imagination, the biting drafts that sliced through their fragile homes. We will smell the thick, ever-present wood smoke that was both their life-giving savior and their slow, choking poison. We will understand the profound, sacred importance of a single, smoldering ember. We will explore, in the most intimate detail, the intricate and ingenious web of strategies, labors, and beliefs that were woven together to create the tough, resilient fabric of winter survival. If you find a sense of peace, a deep and quiet fascination in these long, uninterrupted journeys into the very texture of the past, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support is the vital spark that allows us to keep this fire lit and to continue these explorations for you. Now, let your body find its rest. Let your mind become still and receptive. Our long watch in the deep, unyielding heart of the medieval winter has begun. The first, last, and most desperate battle of the winter was the battle for shelter, the primary defense against the unceasing assault of the cold, the wind, and the wet was the peasant's home. This was a structure that a later age would romanticize or dismiss as a hovel, a hut, or a shack. But for the family that lived within its walls, it was their only fortress. It was a small, fragile, and deeply, profoundly imperfect fortress, but it was the essential bastion that stood between the warmth of life and the cold of death. And at the very heart of this fortress, its living, breathing soul, was the fire of the hearth. Before we can feel the cold of the medieval winter, we must first understand the vessel that was meant to contain the warmth. The peasant's house was not a product of architects and engineers. It was a product of the land itself, an organic structure built by the hands of the family who would inhabit it, using only the materials that the earth and the Lord's woods could provide, and only the tools they themselves could wield. The story of the hovel begins not with the walls, but with the earth itself. The placement of a peasant's home was not a random act. It was dictated by the rigid structure of the manorial system. The family was granted a small plot of land, their toft, on which to build their house, and an attached strip of garden, the croft, in which to grow their vegetables. This plot was their designated footprint of existence, usually clustered with the other hovels of the village, a small, huddled community for mutual support and protection, never far from the watchful eye of the Lord's manor house and the spiritual gaze of the parish church. The choice of the exact spot within that toft was a matter of practical, generational wisdom. You would seek a slight rise in the ground, a place where the water would drain away rather than pool. You would understand the prevailing winds, orienting your narrow home to present the smallest possible face to the bitter north wind, while allowing the longer wall to catch the weak, precious light of the southern sun. The foundation of this fortress was the earth itself. There were no deep stone-lined cellars, no concrete footings. The construction began by marking the outline of the house on the ground. The most common form of structure, particularly in the earlier medieval period, was the crock frame. This ingenious design involved taking a large, naturally curved oak tree and splitting it down the middle. These two curved halves, the cruck blades, would then be raised and joined at the peak, forming a great Gothic arch. A series of these cruck frames, linked by horizontal beams, would create the fundamental skeleton of the house, a structure that was immensely strong and self-supporting, its feet resting directly on the ground or on a few rough foundation stones. In other regions, a simpler box frame would be used, with upright oak posts sunk a few feet into the earth. The act of digging these post holes was the first true violation of the soil, the first claim on the land. The oak, a tree revered for its strength and longevity, was the preferred choice for this frame. You knew that oak was resistant to rot, that its heartwood could stand for a century in the damp earth. The work of felling and shaping these timbers, using only the power of a simple axe and the brute force of an ADTs, was a monumental task, a testament to the immense physical labor that was the price of shelter. But this direct connection to the earth, while simple, was also the hovel's greatest weakness. The base of the timber posts was in constant contact with the damp ground, making them susceptible to a slow, creeping rot. The lack of a proper foundation meant that the dampness of the winter soil was a permanent and inescapable feature of the home, a cold that seeped upwards through the very ground on which you lived, a constant, low-level assault on the warmth and health of the inhabitants. With the great timber skeleton in place, the next task was to create the walls. These were not solid walls of stone or brick. They were a technology of immense antiquity, a woven membrane known as wattle-and-daub. The creation of these walls was a two-part process, beginning with the wattle, the woven infill that would span the gaps between the oak posts of the frame. The materials for the wattle were governed by the strict laws of the forest. The woods belonged to the lord, and you, as a peasant, had no right to the valuable timber trees. Your rights were limited to the underwood, the smaller, faster-growing trees and shrubs of the forest floor. You had the right to coppice to cut certain trees, like hazel and willow at their base, which would then regrow with a multitude of long, straight, flexible poles. These poles were the building blocks of your walls. You would spend days in the damp, leafleted quiet of the autumn woods, harvesting these poles. The work was rhythmic, the sharp chop of your billhook echoing through the trees. Hazel and willow were prized for their unique combination of strength and flexibility. You would carry these poles back to your building site on your shoulder, a precious harvest of wood. The process of wattling was a form of rough, large-scale basketry. You would first drive a series of smaller, upright stakes, the staves, into the ground and into the main horizontal beams of the timber frame. Then, you would begin to weave the long, flexible hazel or willow poles, the withies, in and out of these staves, creating a strong, dense, and springy lattice. It was a communal task, the work of the whole family, your hands becoming calloused and scratched from the rough bark. The wall that emerged was not a solid barrier. It was a screen, a semi-permeable membrane full of 1,000 tiny gaps and crevices. In the low autumn sun, it would cast a beautiful, dappled light, but you knew that each of those chinks of light was a potential entry point for the winter wind, an invitation to the cold. The wattle was the skeleton of the wall, and it was a skeleton that was born porous. The next stage of the process was to give this wooden skeleton its skin. This was the daub, a substance that was both a marvel of practical chemistry and a profoundly visceral and odorous material. The daub was the medieval equivalent of plaster or concrete, but its ingredients were not purchased from a merchant. They were gathered from the immediate environment. The recipe for daub was ancient and varied slightly from place to place, but the core ingredients were universal. The first was clay. You needed a good, sticky clay, one that would bind well, and you would dig it from the bank of the local stream or from a designated clay pit on the manor's common land. The second ingredient was a binding agent. This was most often chopped straw from the harvest, but animal hair, scrounged from the tannery or from the shearing floor, was even better, its keratin fibers creating a stronger and more flexible bond. The final and most essential ingredient was dung. Fresh cow dung was the prize. It was not just a convenient sticky binder, it was a miracle of engineering. The cow's multi-stomach digestive system meant that the dung was full of finely shredded, partially digested grass fibers, which created a superb reinforced matrix. Furthermore, the chemical composition of the dung, rich in ammonia, acted as a natural preservative and an insect repellent. To the modern nose, the idea is repulsive. To the medieval builder, the sharp and maniacal smell of fresh dung was the smell of durability, the smell of a strong and healthy home. The mixing of the daub was a truly elemental process. A shallow pit would be dug, and the clay, the straw, the dung, and a little water would be thrown in. Then, the whole family, with their trousers rolled up, would get into the pit and tread the mixture with their bare feet. It was a slow, squelching, and exhausting process. The cold, wet, and foul-smelling mixture clinging to their legs and feet. They would tread and churn for hours, until the daub reached the perfect, thick, porridge-like consistency. Then came the application. You would scoop up great handfuls of the cold, wet daub and slap it onto the wattle frame. You would push and smear it into every gap and crevice of the woven lattice, applying it to both the inside and the outside of the wall, building it up into a thick, insulating layer. Your hands would be caked in the mixture, the smell of it filling your nostrils. Once applied, the daub was left to dry slowly in the air. This was a perilous phase. If it dried too quickly in a warm wind, it would crack severely. If a heavy rain came before it was fully cured, it could wash a whole day's work away, leaving a muddy slick on the ground. As it dried, it would shrink, and a network of fine cracks would inevitably appear, tiny fissures that would later become highways for drafts. The finished daub wall was a hard, lumpy, and surprisingly resilient surface. It would often be finished with a thin coat of lime wash, a mixture of lime and water, which would whiten the walls and provide a further degree of weather protection and sanitation. But this skin of earth was never a permanent solution. It was in a constant state of slow decay. The winter rains would soften it, the frosts would crumble it, and the constant settling of the house would open up new cracks. The maintenance of the daub was an endless task, a yearly ritual of patching and replastering to shore up the fortress's defenses against the relentless siege of the weather. The final element of the hovel's shell, its crown and its primary shield against the sky, was the roof. This roof was not made of slate or tile, materials far too expensive and heavy for a peasant's home. It was a deep, thick, shaggy blanket of thatch, a technology as ancient as the wattle and daub walls. The material for the thatch was another gift of the local landscape. In the fens and marshy river valleys, the preferred material was red. Reed was a superb thatching material. Its hollow, waterproof stems, creating a roof that was incredibly durable and could last for generations. But for most peasants, living away from the wetlands, the material was the long straw left over from the grain harvest. After the grain had been threshed, the best, longest, and unbroken stalks of rye or wheat straw were carefully set aside for the thatcher. Thatching was a highly skilled craft, often performed by a specialized traveling artisan, but a peasant would know the basic techniques to roof his own home. The process involved tying the straw into tight bundles, or yelms. These bundles were then laid in overlapping courses onto the timber framework of the roof, starting at the eaves and working up to the ridge. Each course was tightly secured to the roof timbers with tarred cordage made from hemp or with long, pliable bramble stems. The thatcher would work his way up the roof, his legs straddling the peak, his hands a blur of motion as he laid, secured, and combed the straw into place. A finished thatched roof was a thing of great beauty and remarkable utility. It was incredibly thick, often several feet from top to bottom. This great depth made it a fantastic insulator. In the summer, it kept the hovel cool. In the winter, it was a thick blanket that helped to trap the precious, rising heat from the fire below, preventing it from escaping into the cold sky. A well-laid thatch was also wonderfully waterproof. The steep pitch of the roof and the overlapping layers of straw shedding even the heaviest rain with ease. But this crown of straw was also a living ecosystem, a world unto itself. Its warm, dry, and sheltered depths were a perfect and irresistible home for a vast community of creatures. Mice and rats would burrow into the thatch, creating complex networks of tunnels. Birds, particularly sparrows and starlings, would build their nests deep within its layers. The roof would be alive with a universe of insects, spiders, and other invertebrates. This living quality was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, the constant activity of these creatures would slowly degrade the thatch, their burrowing and nesting creating channels that would eventually allow water to seep through. A slow, persistent drip from the ceiling was a common winter misery. On the other hand, this ecosystem could also provide a small, if unconventional, source of food. A clever peasant might know how to set a snare at the entrance to a rat's tunnel, or how to catch the sparrows that roosted in the eaves. The thatch required constant maintenance. After a storm, you would have to inspect the roof for any damage, replacing any dislodged bundles of straw. Every few years, a new layer of thatch would need to be added on top of the old, gradually increasing the roof's thickness and weight. But despite its flaws, the thatched roof was a masterful adaptation to the available resources, a warm, living, and breathing crown on the simple fortress of the peasant hovel. The final components of the hovel's shell were its openings, the necessary breaches in the fortress wall that allowed for entry and for some small measure of light and air. These openings were also the greatest points of weakness in the defense against the winter cold, the primary entry points for the relentless, probing attacks of the wind. Windows, in our sense of the word, did not exist in the common peasant hovel. Glass was a substance of almost unimaginable luxury, reserved for the churches and the greatest of castles. The openings in the daub walls were small and few, designed more for ventilation to let out the thick smoke of the fire than to let in the light. They were windies, literally eyes for the wind. In the summer, these openings might be left open to the air, but as winter approached, they became gaping wounds in the hovel's defense. The primary method of closing them was to stuff them tightly with whatever was at hand: a bundle of straw, a collection of old greasy rags, or a block of dried moss would be wedged into the opening to block the passage of the wind. A slightly more sophisticated solution was a thin, translucent panel made from scraped and stretched animal horn. This horn pane would be set in a simple wooden frame and would allow a dim, milky, and distorted light to filter through, but it was fragile and expensive, a luxury that most peasants could not afford. For the majority, the closing of the windows at the start of winter meant plunging the interior of the hovel into an even deeper, more profound gloom. The door was the largest and most vulnerable opening of all. It was not a finely jointed, well-fitting piece of carpentry. It was a simple, brutalist structure, often just a few rough-hewn planks of wood, held together with a cross-batten, hung on simple leather hinges. It would rarely fit its frame properly. There would be a significant gap at the bottom, and a network of smaller cracks and gaps around the sides. The latch was a simple wooden bar that was lifted by a string passed through a hole in the door. The security it offered was minimal, but the true enemy was not the thief. It was the draught. This door was a sieve for the wind. To combat this, you would hang a heavy curtain of thick, coarse woolen cloth or an old animal hide over the inside of the door, a wind cloth that would help to baffle the worst of the incoming cold air. At the base of the door, you would lay a sausage of cloth stuffed with straw, a draft excluder, in a constant battle to block the icy current that flowed across the earthen floor. But the battle against the drafts was a battle that was never truly won. The wind was a cunning and relentless adversary. It would probe every weakness of the structure: the cracks in the daub, the gaps around the door, the small holes in the thatch, the ill-fitting window plugs. The inside of the hovel was a complex landscape of air currents. The family would learn to read this invisible landscape. They knew which corner of the room was the most drafty, which seat by the fire was most sheltered. The constant low-level hiss of the wind, finding its way through 100 tiny fissures, was the background music of the winter months. It was a perpetual reminder of the fragility of their shelter, a constant whisper that the wild, cold world was always, and in all ways, trying to get in. In the center of the small, dark, and draughty fortress of the hovel stood its commander, its great and terrible god, its living son. This was the hearth. It was not the contained chimneyed fireplace of a later age. It was a raw, open, and elemental fire, a creature of immense power and profound contradictions. It was the source of all warmth, all light, and all cooked food. It was the absolute, non-negotiable heart of winter survival, but it was also a source of constant labor, of choking smoke, and of terrifying danger. The life of the peasant family did not just revolve around the hearth. It was tethered to it, a small, huddled flock bound to their single, flickering star. The medieval peasant's hearth was a masterpiece of simplicity and function. It was located in the very center of the single-room hovel. This central placement was a deliberate and brilliant piece of thermal engineering. A fire against a wall loses a huge amount of its heat to the cold stone or door behind it. An open, central fire radiates its heat in all directions, a 360-degree circle of warmth that allowed the maximum number of people to benefit from its glow. It created a small, habitable island of warmth in the middle of the cold sea of the earthen floor. The construction of the hearth was simple. A section of the floor would be dug out and lined with flat stones or a thick layer of fire-resistant clay, creating a shallow, fireproof bowl. In some cases, a single, large, flat hearthstone would form the base. This was the altar upon which the daily sacrifice of fuel would be made. There was no chimney. Directly above the hearth, a hole was left in the peak of the thatched roof. This smoke hole was the fire's only lung, a simple vent intended to draw some, but never all, of the smoke out of the living space. This fire was a living entity, a member of the household with its own needs and its own personality. Its character changed throughout the day. In the morning, it was a small, fragile creature, a bed of glowing embers being coaxed back to life. During the day, it was a steady, working fire, the cauldron of pottage bubbling over its heart. In the evening, it was the social center of the world, its flickering light casting dancing shadows on the rough walls, the only illumination in the profound darkness. The superstitions surrounding the hearth were many and deep. It was considered desperately unlucky to let the fire go out completely. A healthy, bright fire was a sign of a healthy, prosperous household. A smoky, sputtering fire was a bad omen. The hearth was the sacred center, the place where the family was forged into a single, cohesive unit by the shared, primal need for its warmth. The demands of this living altar were insatiable. Its one, constant, and desperate cry was for fuel. The gathering of this fuel was not a simple task. It was the great, defining labor of the autumn months and a constant, background anxiety throughout the winter. The quest for firewood was a complex negotiation between the peasants' needs, the lord's laws, and the dwindling resources of the winter landscape. The woods that surrounded the village were not a free and open resource. They were the property of the lord of the manor, and they were a valuable asset, a source of timber for his building projects and a hunting ground for his pleasure. The laws of the forest were strict and brutally enforced. A peasant caught cutting down a living tree, a greenwood, would face the lord's justice in the manorial court. The punishments were severe, a crippling fine that could bankrupt a family, a public flogging, or even, for a repeat offender, the branding or mutilation that would mark him as a thief for life. The forest was policed by the lord's reeve, or a designated woodward, figures of fear and authority who patrolled the woods, ever watchful for the telltale sound of an illegal axe. The peasants' rights to the forest were ancient, customary, and strictly limited. These were the rights of Istavar, the right to take wood for fuel, for building, and for repairs. But this was not a right to take any wood. It was almost always limited to deadwood. The most common of these rights was by hook or by crook. This gave the peasant the right to take any dead branches that they could pull down from a standing tree with a simple, long-handled shepherd's crook, or any deadwood on the forest floor that they could gather with a small reaper's hook or sickle. This meant that the gathering of fuel was a relentless and inefficient scavenger hunt. The entire family, including the children, would spend countless hours combing the cold, damp floor of the autumn woods. Every fallen branch, every dry twig, every piece of rotten stump was a prize. The work was competitive. You were in a race with your neighbors, all of you scouring the same limited territory for the same scarce resource. You would learn to read the woods, to know which areas were most likely to yield a good supply of fallen oak or ash, the woods that burned long and hot, and which areas only offered the fast-burning, less desirable whitethorn or alder. The gathered wood would be bundled and carried back to the hovel on your back, a heavy, awkward load that represented perhaps a single day's worth of warmth. This wood was stacked in a woodpile against the outer wall of the hovel, in the most sheltered spot possible to keep it dry. The size of this woodpile was a direct and visible measure of a family's wealth and security. A large, well-stocked pile was a source of pride and comfort. A small, dwindling pile was a source of constant, gnawing anxiety. As the winter deepened and the supply of icily gathered deadwood was exhausted, the search for fuel would become more desperate. You would turn to anything that could burn. You might have the right to cut peat from the common bogland, a back-breaking task that involved slicing the wet, heavy turf into bricks and stacking them to dry for months. Peat burned with a slow, smoldering, and intensely smoky heat, but it was a valuable fuel. In areas without wood or peat, the fuel of last resort was tath, the dried dung of the farm animals. The family would collect the cowpats from the pasture, mix them with straw, and form them into rough bricks that were left to dry in the wind. This dung burned with a surprisingly hot, if pungent, fire. The great scavenge for fuel was a constant, background struggle that defined the rhythm of the peasant's year. It was a world of hard limits, of constant labor, and of a deep, practical understanding of the thermal properties of every type of wood, root, and excrement the land had to offer. The fire that burned on the central hearth was not a roaring bonfire. A large, blazing fire was a luxury, a shocking waste of the precious, hard-won fuel. The art of the winter fire was the art of conservation, of extracting the maximum amount of heat from the minimum amount of wood. This art was the domain of the woman of the house, the keeper of the flame. Her skill was most evident in the daily cycle of the fire. Her last act before the family huddled down to sleep was to bank the fire for the night. She would push all the glowing embers into a tight mound. Then, she would carefully cover this mound with a thick, insulating layer of ash from the edges of the hearth. This blanket of ash would starve the embers of oxygen, preventing them from burning out, but allowing them to retain their heat, to smolder in a state of suspended animation throughout the long, cold night. Her first act in the utter darkness and biting chill of the pre-dawn morning was the resurrection of the flame. She would approach the grey, seemingly lifeless mound of ash and, with a gentle hand, scrape it away, revealing the still glowing ruby-red heart of the embers from the night before. She would then place a small handful of the driest tinder onto these embers. This tinder was a carefully prepared and treasured resource. Dried moss, the fluffy down of a thistle, or a piece of charcloth, a piece of linen that had been partially burned in a sealed container until it was pure, black, and highly flammable. Then, she would get down on her knees and, with her own breath, gently blow on the embers. The first tentative wisp of smoke would appear. She would blow again, a long, steady, and patient stream of air. The tinder would begin to glow, and then, with a sudden, magical rush, it would burst into a tiny, fragile flame. She would feed this infant flame with the smallest, driest twigs, then with slightly larger sticks, slowly and carefully building it up until it was a stable, self-sustaining fire. To be able to perform this daily miracle was a fundamental skill of survival. To fail, to let the fire die completely, was a small but significant catastrophe. It meant a cold and miserable morning, and a trip, in shame, to the hearth of a neighbor to beg for a burning brand or a pan of hot coals to bring your own dead hearth back to life. Throughout the day, she managed the fire with a miser's prudence. She would add a single log at a time, positioning it carefully to catch the flame and burn slowly and efficiently. She understood the character of her wood. She knew that a piece of dry oak would burn for hours with a steady, glowing heat, while a piece of alder would burn quickly with a bright flame, but little lasting warmth. She was the master of a slow, smoldering fire, a fire that was a tool for cooking and a source of radiant heat, not a spectacle. This intimate, daily relationship with the fire, this deep understanding of its needs and its moods, was one of the most essential and unsung skills of the medieval peasant woman. The living sun at the center of the hovel was a god that demanded a constant, choking sacrifice from its worshippers. The open hearth, with its simple smoke hole, was a profoundly inefficient system of ventilation. The inevitable and overwhelming consequence was a living space that was permanently filled with a thick, stinging, and toxic haze of wood. The physics of the situation was simple and inescapable. The hot air and smoke from the fire would rise, but the cold, dense winter air pressing down on the roof would often prevent it from escaping cleanly through the smoke hole. The smoke would therefore spread out under the thatched roof, filling the upper half of the room with a dense, swirling cloud. It would cool, and then slowly sink, creating a layered atmosphere. The clearest, most breathable air was in the lowest 2 or 3 feet of the room, near the floor. To live in the hovel was to learn to live in a stooped position, to sit on low stools, to keep your head below the worst of the smoke layer. The sensory experience of this environment would have been overwhelming. The smoke was not the clean, pleasant aroma of a modern wood-burning stove. It was the product of burning unseasoned, often damp wood, and it was thick, greasy, and full of particulate matter. It would sting the eyes, causing a constant, weeping irritation that would lead to chronic eye infections and, in many cases, to a gradual decline in vision. It would catch in the throat, triggering a deep, rasping, and persistent cough. The winter cough. That was a universal affliction. Everything within the hovel was permeated by the smoke. The rafters of the roof were coated in a thick, black, greasy layer of creosote. The daub walls were stained a dingy brown. A fine layer of soot settled on every surface. The clothes of the family, Their hair, their very skin, were permanently imbued with the pungent, acrid smell of wood smoke. It was a smell from which there was no escape. The long-term health consequences of living in such an environment were devastating. The constant inhalation of smoke and particulate matter would lead to a range of chronic respiratory illnesses. What a modern doctor would diagnose as bronchitis, emphysema, and lung cancer. The irritation of the eyes could lead to conditions like trachoma, a bacterial infection that could eventually cause blindness. The smoke-filled hovel, the very fortress that was meant to protect life, was also a slow, insidious poison that was shortening the lives of those it sheltered. The warmth of the fire was the warmth of life, but the price of that warmth was paid with every single, stinging breath. The fire was the hovel's heart, but it was also its most terrifying and unpredictable enemy. In a structure built of wood, straw, and dried mud, the threat of a catastrophic fire was not a remote possibility. It was a constant, daily, and deeply ingrained fear. The peasants spoke of fire in hushed, respectful tones, sometimes calling it the red flower, a beautiful and poetic name for a force that could blossom with terrifying speed and consume their entire world. The danger came from the open hearth itself. A sudden, powerful gust of wind coming down the smoke hole could be a harbinger of disaster. It could blow a shower of sparks and glowing embers out of the hearth and onto the dry, combustible straw that covered the earthen floor. A single, unnoticed spark, landing in the right place, could smolder for minutes before erupting into a tiny flame. The family was trained in constant vigilance. A bucket of water or a pail of sand was always kept near the hearth, ready to be thrown onto any errant sparks. The area immediately around the hearth was kept as clear as possible. But the greatest fear was not a fire on the floor. It was a fire in the roof. The same gust of wind that could blow sparks downwards could also carry them upwards. A single light, glowing ember could be lofted up in the column of hot air and find its way to the underside of the thick, tinder-dry thatch. The thatch, coated with years of greasy, flammable soot, was the perfect fuel. A fire that took hold in the thatch was an almost instantaneous and unstoppable catastrophe. Imagine the moment of realization. A sudden, brighter-than-usual flicker of light from above. The smell of burning straw cutting through the usual scent of wood smoke. The terrifying crackling roar as the fire finds the oxygen-rich air on the outside of the roof. There would be a single, primal scream of fire, and a frantic, desperate scramble to escape. There was no time to save possessions. The priority was life. The family would stumble out into the freezing night, perhaps dragging a panicked, tethered animal with them, and turn to watch in horror as their entire world was consumed. A thatched roof on fire does not burn slowly, it erupts. The hovel would become a blazing torch, a pillar of fire against the black winter sky, the red flower in its most terrible and magnificent bloom. The heat would be intense, the sound a deafening roar. In a matter of minutes, the roof would collapse inwards, and the entire structure would be reduced to a pile of smoking, glowing ruins. The consequences of such a fire were absolute. The family would be left with nothing but the clothes on their backs, their stored food, their tools, their bedding, their home all gone. They would be cast upon the mercy of their neighbors, who, while likely compassionate, had little to spare themselves. They would become beggars, reliant on the charity of the parish or the grim, unsentimental aid of the lord of the manor. In the heart of the winter, to lose your home to fire was often a death sentence. This constant, abiding fear was the price of the hearth's warmth. The living sun that made survival possible could, in a single, careless moment, become the agent of their complete and utter destruction. The fortress of the hovel, with its living sun at its core, was more than just a physical shelter. It was the container for the entirety of the peasant family's winter existence. The modern concept of a house with separate rooms for different functions, room for cooking, a room for sleeping, a room for socializing, was an unimaginable luxury. The peasant's hovel was a single all-purpose space, a one-room world where every aspect of life, from the most mundane to the most intimate, was lived out in a shared, public, and often suffocating proximity. This huddling together was not a choice. It was a fundamental strategy for the conservation of heat, of resources, and of the very spirit of the family unit. The rhythm of the peasant's winter life was dictated not by the clock, but by the sun. And in the depths of a northern winter, the sun was a weak and fleeting visitor. The days were brutally short. The sun would rise late, a pale, watery disk in a grey sky, and it would sink below the horizon again in the mid-afternoon. This scarcity of natural light had a profound and compressive effect on the peasant's world. While the sun was up, the man and the older children would be outside, engaged in the hard, cold labor of the winter, repairing fences, digging drainage ditches, tending to the livestock, or scavenging for wood. The woman might be engaged in similar outdoor tasks, or she might be working inside, taking advantage of the weak light that filtered through the open door or the small, unglazed window openings. But as the sun began its descent, usually around 3 or 4 in the afternoon, the world would begin to shrink. The family would retreat from the cold, grey landscape and gather inside the hovel, securing the door and stuffing the window openings against the coming night. From this moment until the dawn of the next day, a span of some 16 or 17 hours, their entire universe would be reduced to the small, flickering circle of firelight cast by the central hearth. The darkness that lay beyond this circle was absolute. In a world without any form of public lighting, a moonless, overcast winter night was a blackness so profound that it is difficult for us, in our light-polluted age, to imagine it was a physical presence, a thick, cold, and menacing void. The world outside the hovel ceased to exist. The forest was the domain of the wolf and of the supernatural terrors that populated the medieval imagination. Ghosts, demons, and evil spirits. To venture out into this darkness was an act of extreme folly or desperation. Inside, the only source of light was the fire itself. Its wavering, uncertain glow cast long, dancing shadows that turned the familiar objects of the room into strange and sometimes frightening shapes. This firelight was sufficient for broad tasks, but it was a poor light for any fine work. To supplement it, the family would use the making of rushlights was another of the patient, frugal tasks of the autumn. The women and children would gather the long stems of the common rush plant from the marshy ground. They would then perform the delicate task of peeling away the outer green bark, leaving a single, thin strip to support the fragile, white inner pith. These prepared rushes would then be dipped repeatedly into a pan of hot, melted fat. This was the most expensive component, the kitchen fat, the precious, rendered drippings saved from the cooking of their bacon or any other meat, stored in a pot for this very purpose. The pith would soak up the hot fat, and when it cooled, it would be a stiff, greasy taper. A rushlight did not provide a bright, steady flame. It gave off a small, feeble, and smoky light, more of a persistent glow than a true flame, and it smelled of burning fat. It would only burn for 10 or 15 minutes before it was consumed. A simple, forked holder, stuck into a block of wood, would hold the rushlight at an angle to control the speed of its burn. To have light for a few hours in the evening required a constant supply of these carefully made and jealously guarded rushlights. They were the currency of the night, their dim, smelly glow, the only thing that held the great, pressing darkness at bay. The long hours of this enforced fire-lit confinement were a time for the essential indoor work of winter. This was when the tools were repaired, the baskets were woven, and the wool was spun. But it was also a time of intense social and cultural transmission. It was in this smoky darkness, huddled around the hearth, that the stories were told. The old grandmother would recount the folk tales, the legends of the saints, the stories of heroic deeds and mischievous fairies. The father would teach his sons the lore of the land, the names of the fields, the boundaries of the manor. The mother would sing the ancient, mournful ballads. This was the peasants' library, their theatre, their school. The culture of the village was not written in books. It was woven in the darkness, a rich tapestry of spoken words, of songs, of shared memories, passed down from one generation to the next in the shrinking world of the winter hovel. When the stories were told and the mending was done, the time came for sleep. The transition from the waking world to the sleeping world was not one of privacy and comfort. It was a further act of huddling, a final, desperate strategy for the conservation of warmth against the coldest hours of the night. This was the strategy of the communal bed. The bed itself was the most valuable piece of furniture in the hovel, if it could be called furniture at all. In the poorest of homes, it was simply a designated corner of the earthen floor, piled high with bracken or straw. In a slightly more prosperous home, it was a palliasse, a large sack made of coarse, rough-spun hemp or linen, stuffed tightly with the same materials. This straw-filled mattress was laid directly on the floor, in the warmest part of the room, as close to the banked and smouldering hearth as was safely possible. A very fortunate family might have a simple wooden frame to raise this mattress off the cold, damp earth, but for most, the bed was part of the floor itself. Into this single bed, the entire family would climb. The father, the mother, the children, from the oldest to the youngest infant, and often an elderly and dependent grandparent, would all lie down together. They did not undress. They slept in the same coarse, woolen tunics and leggings that they wore during the day. To undress in the freezing air of the hovel would have been an act of madness. Sleeping clothes also meant they were always ready to leap up if the fire sparked, or to face whatever the night might bring. They would arrange themselves for maximum warmth. The smallest children often nestled between the larger bodies of the parents. Over this great pile of humanity, they would pull their shared coverings. This was not a soft, downy duvet. It was a single, heavy, and intensely scratchy woolen blanket, a product of the woman's own spinning and weaving. Or it might be an animal hide, a sheepskin, or a cowhide, with the hair left on for extra warmth. The primary purpose of this arrangement was thermal efficiency. A single, isolated human body loses heat rapidly in a cold environment, but a group of bodies huddled closely together creates a human furnace. Their combined body heat is trapped under the blanket, creating a microclimate of shared warmth that is significantly warmer than the surrounding air. This was a vital, life-saving strategy that allowed them to survive the coldest nights, when the temperature inside the hovel might drop well below freezing. But the reality of this experience was one of almost unimaginable intimacy and a complete lack of what we would consider basic hygiene. The pallias was a thriving ecosystem of its own. It was inevitably infested with fleas, with lice, and with other biting insects, for whom this warm, huddled mass of humanity was a perfect feeding ground. The straw would become compacted and soiled over time, and would only be changed once or twice a year. The bed was a place of constant low-level irritation, of scratching and itching in the darkness. It was a world of shared smells and sounds. The air under the blanket would be thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, of stale sweat, of bad breath. The night would be filled with the sounds of this shared sleep, the deep snores of the father, the mother's tired sighs, the coughing of a grandparent, the whimpering of a restless child. Every sickness, every fever, every cough was shared in this intimate space, making the bed a powerful vector for the transmission of disease within the family. This was sleep born of utter physical exhaustion, not of peaceful repose. It was a functional necessity, a nightly act of communal survival. The human furnace was a testament to the family's strength as a single, cohesive unit, their bodies literally becoming the last line of defense against the killing cold of the winter night. The community that huddled for warmth in the single room of the hovel was not exclusively human. As the winter weather turned truly severe, the family's most valuable and vulnerable assets, their livestock, were brought inside to share the precious, fire-warmed space. The hovel, in the depths of winter, was not just a home, it was an ark. This practice was born of absolute economic necessity. For a peasant family, their animals were their wealth, their insurance policy, and their key to surviving the next year. The family's single milk cow was a source of precious milk, butter, and cheese, and the promise of a calf in the spring. Their pig, being fattened for the autumn slaughter, was their main source of preserved meat. Their few sheep were the source of the wool that clothed them. To lose one of these animals to the cold, to a predator like a wolf, or to a desperate human thief, was not an inconvenience. It was a catastrophe. It could tip the precarious balance of their existence from mere poverty into utter destitution. And so, as the first hard frosts gave way to the deep freezes of midwinter, the animals came inside. The layout of many peasant hovels, the longhouse design, reflected this practice. The structure was a long, single room, but it was often subtly divided. The end of the room closest to the hearth was the human domain. The far end, often a step down and with a slightly sloping floor for drainage, was the animal byre. There was no wall or permanent partition between these two spaces, only a low wooden beam or a wattle hurdle to mark the boundary. Each evening, the beasts would be led in through the single door. The cow would be tethered in her designated spot, the sheep in a small pen, the chickens might roost on a beam in the rafters. The presence of these large animals had a profound and immediate effect on the environment of the hovel. The most significant and most welcome effect was the warmth. A large animal like a cow is a massive, slow-burning furnace. Her body, with its complex digestive system, generates a tremendous amount of heat. The combined body heat of a cow, a few sheep, and a pig, added to the heat of the human furnace and the smoldering hearth, could raise the ambient temperature of the small, enclosed space by several crucial degrees. This animal heat was a significant and reliable contribution to the hovel's thermal economy, a non-negotiable part of the winter survival strategy. Bringing the animals inside also provided them with security. The thick daub walls and the securely barred door offered protection from the wolves that roamed the winter landscape, their hunger made bold by the scarcity of wild prey. It also protected them from the two-legged predators, the desperate neighbors or wandering vagrants who might be tempted to steal a sheep in the dead of night. With the animals sleeping just a few feet away, they were safe under the family's watchful and listening care. But these benefits came at a considerable cost to the living conditions of the human inhabitants. The animals brought their own powerful and pervasive smells. The sweet, grassy scent of their hay and their cud-scented breath would mingle with the sharp, ammoniacal temps of their urine and the earthy, pungent odor of their dung. The hovel would smell not just of smoke and humanity, but of the barnyard. They brought their own sounds. The night was not silent. It was filled with the soft, rhythmic chewing of the cow's cud, the occasional low moo, the nervous bleating of a sheep, the rustle and snort of the pig in its straw. These sounds were a comfort, a sign that the family's wealth was safe and alive, but they were also a constant presence in the shared soundscape of the night. And, of course, they brought their own waste. While the sloping floor was designed to let some of the liquid waste drain away, the solid dung would accumulate. Mucking out the animal end of the hovel was a daily morning chore, the valuable manure being added to the compost heap that would fertilize the garden in the spring. But the cleanliness was never perfect. The air was thick with the smells of the byre, and the risk of disease transmission between the animals and the humans sharing the same air was immense. The winter hovel was therefore a strange and crowded ark. It was a place where the boundaries between the human and the animal world were almost completely dissolved. The family and their beasts were a single codependent community, sharing the same air, the same warmth, the same shelter. This intimate, and to our minds unsanitary, coexistence was not a sign of barbarism. It was a sign of a deep, pragmatic, and unsentimental understanding of the fragile web of survival. The life of the family depended on the life of their animals, and in the heart of the winter, their lives were literally and warmly intertwined. The war against the cold, fought in the smoky fortress of the hovel, was a visceral and immediate struggle, a nightly negotiation with the raw power of the elements. But there was another, longer, and more insidious war that defined the winter months. This was the silent, creeping, and utterly relentless war against hunger. For the medieval peasant, winter was not a season of feasting and abundance. It was the great annual famine, a long, slow, and meticulously managed retreat from the bounty of the harvest. It was a season-long exercise in the grim arithmetic of survival, a constant calculation of calories consumed versus calories remaining. The success of their entire year, their ability to survive to see the next planting season, was entirely dependent on the foresight and the back-breaking labor of the autumn and the disciplined, iron-willed rationing that would make the fruits of that labor last. The winter larder, the peasant's collection of stored food, was not a place of culinary delight. It was the battlefield upon which this desperate war against starvation was fought, every single day, for 4 long, dark months. The defining characteristic of the peasant's winter diet was its almost complete lack of freshness. The vibrant, living world of the summer garden and the autumn field had to be captured, transformed, and suspended in time. The very life force of the food, its moisture and its vulnerability to decay, had to be driven out through the ancient and powerful alchemies of preservation. The technologies available were simple, elemental, and brutally effective. The desiccating power of the sun and the air, the searing, transformative magic of salt, the pungent antiseptic kiss of wood smoke, and the sour, bubbling miracle of fermentation. The winter larder was a museum of these transformations, a collection of mummified, salted, smoked, and pickled substances that were the pale but life-sustaining ghosts of the summer's abundance. The absolute, unshakable bedrock of the winter larder, the great caloric foundation upon which all else was built, was grain. The entire agricultural year, with its rhythms of plowing, sowing, weeding, and reaping, was geared towards the production of this single, indispensable commodity. For the peasant, grain was not just a food. It was wealth. It was security. It was the very staff of life. The autumn harvest, the culmination of the year's labor, was a period of frantic and exhausting work. The peasant and his family would toil from dawn until dusk in the Lord's fields, cutting the ripe grain with their simple sickles, their backs aching, their hands raw. This was their primary obligation under the manorial system. For several days a week, their labor belonged to the Lord, and the vast majority of the grain they harvested would be carted off to fill the Lord's great stone-built granary, a formidable symbol of his power and his control over their lives. But after their labor dues were met, they would have the right to harvest the produce of their own small strips of land in the village's common fields. This was their share, the portion that had to see their family through the coming year. The grain they grew was not the fine, high-yield wheat that the Lord favored, a valuable cash crop that would be ground into white flour for the tables of the wealthy. The peasant's crop was the hardier, less glamorous, and more resilient stuff. It was rye, a tough and adaptable grain that could thrive in the poor, acidic soils and damp climate of northern Europe. It was barley, the grain of the brewer, but also a vital food source. And it was oats, a humble and robust grain that was often seen as fit for animals, but which formed a crucial part of the peasant diet. Once harvested and threshed a brutal, dusty process of beating the grain from the stalks with wooden flails, this precious life-giving grain had to be stored. The storage of the grain was a matter of life and death, a constant battle against a trinity of powerful enemies: damp, vermin, and mold. The methods of storage were simple and ingenious. Some peasants would have a hutch, a large, lidded wooden chest kept inside the hovel, raised off the damp earth on short legs. But a more common and ancient method was the underground storage pit. A deep pit would be dug in a patch of dry, well-drained soil, often inside the hovel itself, to keep it secure. The walls of the pit would be lined with a thick layer of woven straw, and then with a layer of puddled clay, which would be fired in place with a small, intense bonfire to create a hard, waterproof, ceramic-like shell. The grain would be poured into this subterranean silo, and the pit would be sealed with another layer of clay and a stone slab. In the cool, dark, and oxygen environment of the sealed pit, the grain could, in theory, last for years, but the dangers were ever present. The damp was a relentless foe. A poorly lined pit, or a hutch kept against a damp wall, could allow moisture to seep into the grain. This could cause the grain to sprout, consuming its own precious calories, or, far more dangerously, it could encourage the growth of mold. A moldy patch of grain was not just a loss of food, it was a potential source of poison. Certain molds, like ergot, which grew readily on rye in damp conditions, were fantastically toxic. Ergotism, known in the Middle Ages as St. Anthony's fire, was a horrific and often fatal condition. It could cause vivid hallucinations, convulsions, and a terrifying gangrene that would cause the victim's limbs to blacken, shrivel, and fall off. A single patch of infected rye, ground into flour and baked into the family's bread, could poison the entire household. The peasant woman, when she took her grain from the store, would inspect it with a keen and anxious eye, smelling it, feeling it, looking for any sign of the telltale dark fungal growths. The second great enemy was the army of vermin. The world of the medieval village was teeming with rats and mice, creatures that were perfectly adapted to live alongside humans and to steal their stored food. A tiny hole in a storage chest, a crack in the seal of a storage pit, was an open invitation. A colony of rats could, over the course of a winter, consume a terrifying portion of a family's grain supply. The family cat, if they were fortunate enough to have one, was not a pampered pet. It was a vital and respected working animal, a guardian of the larder. Traps, made of wood and string, would be set. But the battle against the nibbling, ever-present threat of the rodent army was a constant and often losing one. Every grain eaten by a rat was a grain stolen from the mouth of a child. This grain, so carefully won and so jealously guarded, was the central pillar of the winter diet. It would be taken, in small, carefully measured quantities, to the Lord's mill to be ground into a coarse, dark, wholemeal flour, a portion of the flour being paid to the miller as his fee. This flour would be used to bake the peasant's bread, the maslin bread, a dense, heavy, and often sour loaf made from a mixture of rye and other grains. This dark bread was not just a food, it was an edible plate, a trencher, upon which the daily pottage would be served. the bread soaking up the liquid and being eaten at the end of the meal. The grain was the staff of life, the central, irreplaceable source of the calories that would fuel the body's furnace against the winter's cold. If grain was the caloric bedrock of the winter larder, then legumes were its protein-rich reinforcement. In the small garden plot, the croft, that every peasant family was allotted behind their hovel, a significant portion of the space was dedicated to the growing of peas and beans. These were not the tender, sweet vegetables we know today. These were tough, starchy field peas and fava beans, varieties bred not for their flavor when fresh, but for their ability to be dried and stored. The cultivation of these legumes was a vital part of the peasants' agricultural strategy. They understood, through centuries of observation, that planting peas or beans in a plot of land seemed to enrich the soil, that a crop of grain planted in that same plot the following year would grow stronger and healthier. They did not know the science of nitrogen fixation, the magical ability of these plants to capture nitrogen from the air and store it in their roots, but they knew the results. The legumes were not just a food source, they were a key part of maintaining the long-term fertility of their small, precious patch of cultivable land. The harvest of the legumes was a simple and patient process. The plants were not picked green. They were left in the garden until the pods had become dry, brown, and brittle, rattling in the autumn wind. The entire plants were then pulled up, bundled, and hung from the rafters of the hovel to dry completely in the smoky air. When they were bone dry, the shelling would begin. This was a classic winter evening task, performed by the whole family huddled around the hearth. The dry, rustling plants would be taken down, and the family would sit for hours, their fingers working to split open the papery pods and release the small, hard, stone-like peas and beans. The rhythmic clicking of the dried legumes falling into a wooden bowl or a pottery crock was one of the characteristic sounds of the winter hovel. These dried peas and beans were a form of concentrated, long-lasting protein. They were stored in simple cloth sacks, hung from the rafters to keep them away from the damp and the mice. They were, alongside cheese and the occasional egg, the peasants' primary source of protein, the building blocks that would repair their muscles after a long day of hard labor. The preparation of these dried legumes required a long and slow process of rehydration. A handful of the hard, dense peas would be put to soak overnight in a bowl of water. By morning, they would have swollen to twice their size, their wrinkled skins now smooth. These soaked peas were a key ingredient in the daily pottage, the thick, gruel-like stew that was the centerpiece of every meal. They would be added to the pot with the grain and would simmer for hours, slowly breaking down and adding their own distinct, earthy flavor and their thick, creamy texture to the stew. They were also the basis for peas pottage, or peas pudding, a dish in its own right. A larger quantity of the dried peas would be boiled for a very long time, often with a precious ham bone or a piece of salted bacon for flavor, until they completely disintegrated into a thick, savory, and incredibly filling porridge. A bowl of hot peas pottage was a deeply comforting and substantial meal, a dish that would stick to your ribs and provide the slow-release energy needed to face a day of hard, cold work. The humble, rattling peas in their cloth sack were a quiet but powerful promise of strength, a guarantee that the peasant's body would have the protein it needed to endure the long physical ordeal of the winter. For the medieval peasant, meat was not a daily staple. It was a rare and precious luxury, a taste of festival and of feast days. The peasant did not have the right to hunt the deer and boar in the Lord's forest, and they did not own large herds of cattle. Their primary source of meat came from a single, cherished animal, the pig. The pig was the perfect peasant livestock. It was an intelligent and incredibly efficient creature, a living recycling unit that could be fattened on household scraps, on whey from the cheese-making process, and on what it could forage for itself in the woods. The right of pannage, to let pigs forage for acorns and beechnuts, was a common peasant right. The family pig was an investment, a walking larder that was carefully tended and fattened throughout the year. The autumn, after the harvest, and after the pigs had grown fat on the fallen acorns, was the traditional time for the slaughter. This was a major event in the village calendar, a moment of bloody, communal work and of temporary, glorious abundance. The slaughter of the pig was a skill, performed quickly and efficiently by the men of the village, and once the animal was killed, a process of meticulous and reverent butchery began. For in the peasant economy, a world of profound frugality, absolutely nothing of the pig was to be wasted. The fresh meat, the offal, the liver, the heart, the kidneys, would be eaten immediately, a rare and wonderful feast of fresh, roasted meat that would be remembered for months. But the vast majority of the pig, the prime cuts of muscle, and the precious layers of fat, had to be preserved. It had to be transformed from a perishable substance into a stable, long-lasting store of protein and energy that would last through the entire winter. The primary agent of this transformation, the white crystal that performed this life-sustaining alchemy, was salt. Salt, in the medieval world, was not the cheap, ubiquitous condiment that we know. It was a valuable and carefully controlled commodity. It was produced in coastal salt pans, through the slow evaporation of seawater, or in inland saltworks, by boiling the brine from natural salt springs. It was a heavy, bulk commodity that had to be transported long distances, and it was often taxed by the lord or the king. A peasant would have to purchase his winter supply of salt at the local market, a significant annual expense. This precious, coarse, greyish salt was the key to his family's winter survival. The main method of preserving the pork was dry salting. Large, shallow wooden troughs or stone salting tubs would be brought out. The cuts of pork, the hams, the shoulders, the sides of belly, would be laid in the trough and then rubbed vigorously with a generous amount of the coarse salt. Every surface, every crevice had to be covered. The salt, through the process of osmosis, would begin to work its magic immediately. It would draw the water out of the cells of the meat. This dehydration created an environment where the bacteria that caused spoilage simply could not survive. The meat would be left in the salt for several weeks, turned regularly, the brine that was drawn out being poured away. The process was complete when the meat was transformed. It was no longer soft, pink, and yielding. It was hard, dark, and intensely salty, a solid, almost mummified substance that could now be hung from the rafters of the hovel, where it would be safe from pests and would last for many months. Another product of the pig was lard. The thick layers of back fat were not eaten fresh. They were carefully cut into small pieces and rendered down in a large pot over a low fire. This slow heating would melt the fat, separating it from any connective tissue. The pure, liquid fat, the lard, would then be poured into earthenware pots. As it cooled, it would solidify into a pure white, creamy substance. This was the peasant's primary source of cooking fat and a vital, concentrated source of calories. A spoonful of lard added to the daily pottage would provide a welcome richness and the energy needed for hard, cold work. The crispy, browned pieces of skin and tissue left over from the rendering process, the crackling, were a delicious and savory treat. Even the blood of the pig was not wasted. It would be carefully collected in a bucket at the time of the slaughter. It would then be mixed with oats, barley, and herbs, and stuffed into a cleaned section of the pig's intestine to be boiled. The result was black pudding, a rich, heavy, and highly nutritious food that provided another way of preserving the life force of the animal. In the frugal world of the peasant, every single part of the pig, from its snout to its tail, was transformed, through the alchemy of salt and skill, into a form that would nourish and sustain the family through the long, lean months ahead. Parallel to the magic of salt was the magic of smoke. Smoking was another ancient and highly effective method of preservation, a technique that not only dehydrated the food, but also infused it with powerful naturally occurring chemicals that killed bacteria and prevented decay. The peasant hovel, with its central, open hearth and its constant, thick haze of wood smoke, was, in effect, a giant smokehouse. The process of smoking was a slow and passive one. After a preliminary salting, certain cuts of meat, particularly the fatty belly of the pig that was destined to become bacon, and certain types of fish, like herring or eels, would be hung high up in the rafters of the hovel. They were deliberately placed in the path of the rising column of smoke from the fire, and there they would hang, for weeks and months, in the perpetual, antiseptic haze. The smoke was not just hot air, it was a complex chemical cocktail. The slow, inefficient burning of the damp wood in the hearth produced a smoke that was rich in compounds like phenols and formaldehyde. These chemicals were powerful antibacterial and antifungal agents. As the smoke swirled around the hanging meat, these compounds would penetrate its surface, creating a sterile and hostile environment for the microorganisms of decay. At the same time, the gentle, constant heat from the fire and the dry, smoky air would slowly dehydrate the meat, drawing out its moisture, further enhancing the preservative effect. The fat within the meat would also undergo a change, becoming more stable and less prone to rancidity. The result of this long, slow immersion in the smoky atmosphere was a profound transformation. The pale, soft flesh of the pork belly would become a deep, dark mahogany color, its texture firm and dense. The silvery skin of the herring would turn a beautiful, burnished red gold, giving them their name of red herrings. But the transformation was not just physical, it was a transformation of flavor. The smoke would imbue the food with its own powerful and delicious character. The specific flavor of the smoked food would depend entirely on the type of wood being burned in the hearth below. A fire of oak would impart a strong, robust, and classic smoky flavor. A fire of apple or cherry wood, from the prunings of the orchard, would give a sweeter, fruitier note. A fire of alder, a common riverside tree, would give a more delicate and subtle smoke. The peasant's bacon did not have a generic smoke flavor. It tasted, quite literally, of the specific forest from which he gathered his fuel. This smoked food was another cornerstone of the winter larder. A side of bacon, hanging like a dark leathery shield from the rafters, was a symbol of security, a promise of flavor and fat for the monotonous meals to come. A small piece would be cut off and added to the pottage, its intense, salty, and smoky flavor infusing the entire pot with a deep, savory richness. The smell of the smoking bacon, mingling with the everyday smell of the wood smoke, was the constant, background aroma of the winter hovel, a smell that was at once the cause of their choking coughs and the promise of their continued survival. The final and most mysterious of the preservation alchemies was not about killing life, but about cultivating it. This was the magic of fermentation, the art of using a community of beneficial, invisible organisms to transform a perishable vegetable into a stable, long-lasting, and surprisingly nutritious food. For the peasant, this magic was most often applied to one of the hardiest and most productive vegetables of his garden, the cabbage. The cabbage was a vital part of the peasant's agricultural year. It was a tough and resilient crop, able to thrive in the cool, damp climate. A well-tended cabbage could grow to a great size, its dense, tightly packed leaves representing a huge amount of vegetable matter in a small space. The main harvest of the hard, white winter cabbages took place in the late autumn, just before the first hard frosts. These cabbages could be stored for a few weeks in a cool cellar or a clamp, but they would not last the whole winter. To preserve them, the peasant woman would turn to the ancient art that would produce sauerkraut. The process was a ritual of transformation. The great, heavy heads of cabbage would be brought into the hovel. With a sharp knife, the woman would shred them into fine, pale green ribbons. This was a laborious task, requiring a strong arm and a patient rhythm. The shredded cabbage would then be layered into a large earthenware crock. After each layer of cabbage, she would sprinkle a generous handful of precious salt. The salt was the key, the great controller of this process. It began to work immediately, drawing the water out of the cabbage leaves through osmosis, creating a natural brine. As she layered the cabbage and the salt, she would pound it down with her fist, or with a wooden tamper. This bruising of the cabbage leaves released more of their juice and helped to remove any air pockets. The goal was to create an anaerobic, or oxygen-free, environment, submerged beneath the surface of the brine. When the crock was full, she would place a clean, flat stone or a wooden plate on top of the cabbage, a weight to keep it pressed down and submerged. She would then cover the crock with a cloth and set it in a cool corner of the hovel. Now, the invisible army would begin its work. On the surface of the cabbage leaves lived a natural community of bacteria, particularly those of the lactobacillus family. In the salty, oxygen-free environment of the crock, these specific bacteria were able to thrive, while the bacteria that cause rot could not. These lactobacilli began to feast on the natural sugars in the cabbage, and as they did so, they produced a powerful preservative, lactic acid. For the first week or two, the crock would be alive with a slow, quiet bubbling, as the fermentation produced carbon dioxide gas. A sharp, sour, but clean smell would emanate from the crock. This was the smell of living preservation. The lactic acid being produced would steadily lower the pH of the brine, making it more and more acidic, until it reached a point where almost no spoilage organisms could survive. After a few weeks, the bubbling would subside. The transformation was complete. When the woman lifted the stone weight, the cabbage would be utterly changed. It was no longer crisp and pale green. It was soft, translucent, and a pale golden yellow. The taste was no longer of fresh, sweet cabbage, but of a complex, sharp, and intensely refreshing sourness. This sauerkraut was a nutritional masterpiece. It could be kept in its crock for the entire winter, a ready source of vegetables long after the last turnip had been pulled from the frozen ground. But the fermentation process did more than just preserve the cabbage, it enhanced it. The lactobacilli produced a range of B vitamins, and, most importantly of all, the process preserved the vitamin C that was present in the fresh cabbage. Scurvy, the dreaded disease of vitamin C deficiency, was a constant threat during the long medieval winter. The diet of dried grains and salted meat contained almost none of this vital nutrient. Scurvy was a horrific disease, causing lethargy, bleeding gums, the loosening of teeth, and the reopening of old wounds, eventually leading to death. The regular consumption of sauerkraut, with its preserved store of vitamin C, was one of the peasants' most powerful, if entirely unconscious, medicines against this terrible affliction. The sour pot in the corner of the hovel was not just a source of flavor, it was a life-saving vessel, a testament to the quiet, bubbling, and profoundly beneficial magic of fermentation. The preserved ingredients of the winter larder, the hard grains, the rattling peas, the rock-hard salted pork, the smoky bacon, the sour cabbage were the raw materials of survival, but they were not, for the most part, consumed as separate and distinct dishes. The culinary reality of the peasant's winter was one of profound and almost unimaginable monotony. These ingredients were combined, day after day, in a single, communal, and ever-present vessel, the great iron cauldron that hung over the central hearth. The dish it contained, a thick, bubbling, and endlessly replenished stew, was the pottage. The pottage was not a recipe, it was a process, a living entity, and its taste was the very taste of survival. The great cauldron was the single most important and most valuable cooking implement in the peasant household. It was a heavy, three-legged pot, cast from iron, a material that was expensive and difficult to produce. A family's cauldron was a precious heirloom, passed down from one generation to the next. Its loss or breakage was a domestic catastrophe of the highest order. This single pot was the family's kitchen, its stove, its oven, and its serving dish, all in one. It hung from a hook or a chain suspended from a greenwood pole that was set across the rafters of the hovel, directly over the smouldering heart of the fire. The height of the pot could be adjusted by changing the length of the chain, allowing the cook, the woman of the house, to control the temperature, moving the pot closer to the embers for a vigorous boil, or raising it higher for a slow, gentle simmer. This single pot was the center of her culinary universe, and her skill in managing its contents was the key to her family's daily nourishment. The pottage was a perpetual stew, a dish that was rarely started from scratch and never truly finished. It was a continuous process, a liquid legacy that carried the flavors of one day into the next. Each morning, the woman would approach the cold cauldron. She would stir the thick leftover contents from the previous night's meal. She would then begin the process of replenishment. She would add more liquid water from the well, or, if she was lucky, a splash of the thin, watery small beer. That was the daily drink, or the nutrient-rich whey left over from her cheesemaking. This liquid was the base. Into this liquid, she would add the solids. The foundation was always grain. She would take a handful of coarse, whole grain oats or barley, perhaps bruised in a stone mortar to help them break down, and stir them into the pot. Next would come a scoop of the dried peas or beans that had been soaking overnight. These were the thickeners, the source of the pottage's characteristic thick, gruel-like consistency. Next, she would add whatever vegetables were available. In the early winter, this might be a few hardy leeks or onions from the garden, but as the winter wore on, it would be the stored root vegetables. She would take a hard woody turnip or a pale parsnip that had been kept in a clamper straw-lined pit in the garden and chop it roughly, adding the chunks to the pot. A handful of the sour, preserved cabbage, the sauerkraut, might also be added, its sharp acidity lending a welcome brightness to the otherwise heavy flavors. This mixture of grain, legumes, and vegetables was the daily pottage. It was placed over the fire and left to simmer slowly for the entire day. The long, slow cooking was essential. It was the only way to break down the tough cellulose of the whole grains and the dried legumes, to make their nutrients available to the human body, and to soften the hard, woody texture of the winter vegetables. The hovel would be filled with the constant, thick, and not unpleasant smell of the bubbling pottage, a smell that was a mixture of earthy grains, sweet roots, and the ever-present background of wood. The everyday pottage was a bland, if nourishing, affair. Its flavor was predominantly that of boiled grain, a taste of sheer, unadorned subsistence. But on certain days, this humble base was elevated, transformed by the addition of the ghost of meat. The precious, preserved pork and bacon from the larder were used, not as a main ingredient, but as a powerful and jealously guarded flavoring agent. Perhaps once or twice a week, or to mark a saint's day, the woman would take a small piece of the rock-hard salted pork, or a thick slice of the smoky, blackened bacon. She would not chop this meat up and distribute it. Instead, the piece would be added to the pothole. As the pottage simmered for hours, the magic would happen. The intense saltiness of the cured meat would slowly leach out into the liquid, seasoning the entire pot. The rich, savory fat would melt and render, its oils dispersing through the stew, adding a wonderful richness, a satisfying mouthfeel, and a huge dose of precious life-sustaining calories. The smoky flavor of the bacon would infuse every spoonful, transforming the bland gruel into a deeply comforting and delicious meal. This was an act of profound culinary efficiency. A single, small piece of meat, which, if eaten by one person, would be gone in a moment, was used to flavor an entire cauldron of food, its goodness shared by the whole family. It was the ultimate umami bomb, the savory heart that gave life to the otherwise monotonous dish. At the end of the day, when the family gathered to eat, this precious piece of meat would be fished out of the pot. It was a moment of some ceremony. The meat, now soft, and having given up much of its flavor to the stew, would be carefully and scrupulously divided. The father, as the head of the household, and the one who performed the heaviest labor, would receive the largest share. The mother and the children would receive smaller portions. Each person would savor their tiny morsel of soft, salty meat, a rare and cherished treat, a reminder of the feast of the autumn slaughter. Other, more humble ingredients were also used for flavoring. A handful of wild herbs, gathered from the hedgerow and dried in the rafters-time marjoram. Sage might be added to the pot. A precious onion, carefully stored in the cool darkness, would be chopped and added, its sweet pungency lending a deep savory base to the pottage. The peasant's palate was not deadened by monotony. It was, on the contrary, acutely sensitive to these small and subtle additions of flavor, able to detect and appreciate the slightest variation in the daily theme. The act of eating the pottage was as communal as its cooking. There were no individual plates or bowls in the poorest households. The family gathered around the central hearth, the great iron cauldron still warm from the fire. They would eat directly from this communal pot. Their primary eating utensil was a simple spoon, carved from a piece of wood or horn. They would dip their spoons into the thick, bubbling stew, a shared and intimate act. Their other utensil was their bread. The dense, dark muslin loaf would be cut into thick slices. These slices, the trenchers, would serve as their plates. They would ladle the hot pottage onto the thick slab of bread. The bread would slowly soak up the savory liquid, becoming soft and delicious. After they had finished the pottage on top, they would eat the trencher itself, a final filling and flavorful part of the meal. In this way, nothing was wasted, not even a drop of the precious calorie-rich liquid. The pottage was the taste of winter. It was the taste of the earth, of the grain, of the smoke, of the salt. It was a taste of profound monotony, a flavor repeated day after day, week after week, for the entire season. But it was also the taste of security. It was warm, it was filling, and it was alive. To have a cauldron of pottage bubbling over the fire was to know that, for one more day, the great, hollowing wolf of starvation was being held at bay. It was the taste of survival itself, a thick, savory, and deeply comforting flavor that was etched into the very memory of the medieval peasant. The carefully preserved stores of the winter larder and the perpetual pottage that they fueled were the peasant's first line of defense against starvation. But this was a finite defense, a fortress whose walls grew thinner with each passing day. As the winter deepened, as the midpoint of the season gave way to the long, hungry weeks of what would be called the starving time, before the first signs of spring, the family would be forced to turn outwards again. They would have to look to the bleak, frozen, and seemingly barren landscape in a desperate search for anything that could supplement their dwindling stores. This was the bleak harvest, a time of foraging and hunting, born not of pleasure or sport, but of a deep and growing desperation. The hedgerow, that tangled, living boundary between the fields, was a place of great bounty in the summer and autumn. In the winter, it was a stark, black skeleton of thorny branches. But for the peasant, who knew its secrets with an intimate, plant-by-plant knowledge, it was not entirely empty. It still held a few scattered jewels of sustenance for those with the patience and the sharp eyes to find them. The most visible of these were the berries, the bright blood-red berries of the hawthorn. The haws would cling to the branches long into the winter, a splash of color against the gray sky. They were not a delicacy. The flesh was thin, dry, and mealy, surrounding a large, hard stone, but they were a source of bulk, of a small amount of sugary energy. The women and children would spend cold finger-numbing hours combing the hedgerows, stripping the thorny branches of these small, hard fruits. They would be tossed into the pottage pot, their flesh slowly softening and adding a slight sweet-sour note to the stew. Far more valuable, and a sign of a truly knowledgeable forager, were the rosehips. The wild dog rose, a common inhabitant of the hedgerow, would produce vivid scarlet, flask-shaped fruits after its flowers had faded. These hips would soften and sweeten after the first frosts, and they would persist on the branches throughout the winter. The peasant woman knew these as a powerful restorative. She would gather them, boil them for a long time in a little water, and then mash them through a coarse cloth to remove the irritating, hairy seeds. The result was a thick, fragrant, and intensely tangy, vitamin-rich puree. She did not know that she had created one of the most concentrated sources of vitamin C in the entire winter landscape. She knew only that this syrup of hips seemed to ward off the lassitude, the bleeding gums, and the other symptoms of the dreaded winter scurvy. It was a powerful, instinctive form of folk medicine. Another prize of the hedgerow was the small, bitter, and intensely astringent fruit of the blackthorn. Eaten raw, they would pucker the mouth with their tannin, but you knew that after the first frosts, their bitterness would mellow slightly. While they were too harsh for most to eat, they were a valuable source of flavor and a deep purple color for other concoctions, if you had the means to preserve them. The floor of the woods and the base of the hedgerows were also scoured for the last of the autumn's nuts. The squirrels and the mice would have taken most of them, but a diligent search in the frozen leaf litter might reveal a handful of hazelnuts that had been missed. These were a treasure, a dense package of protein and high-energy oil. They would be cracked with a stone and eaten with a reverent pleasure, a rare taste of rich, nutty sweetness. Even the humble acorn, the fruit of the great oak tree, could be a source of food in the most desperate of times. Acorns were abundant, but they were inedible in their raw state, full of bitter tannins that were toxic to humans. But the peasant held a piece of ancient, almost forgotten knowledge. They knew that these tannins were water-soluble. They would gather the acorns, crush them, and place the mash in a rough-woven bag. They would then leave this bag in a cold, fast-flowing stream for several days. The constant flow of the water would slowly leach away the bitterness. The resulting acorn meal, once dried and ground, was a coarse and heavy, but nutritious, flour. It could be used to extend their precious supply of rye or barley flour, to make a dark, dense, and slightly bitter bread. That could be the difference between having something to eat and having nothing at all. This was the knowledge of deep winter, the wisdom of survival that knew how to turn even the bitterest fruits of the forest into a life-sustaining meal. The greatest prize that the winter landscape had to offer was animal protein, a taste of fresh meat in a world of salt and smoke. But the peasants' access to this resource was severely, and often brutally, restricted. The forest and the fields were the lord's personal larder. The high game, the deer, the wild boar, the fallow deer were his exclusive property, a symbol of his aristocratic status, and the quarry for his ritualized hunts. The penalties for poaching this venison were the most severe in the manorial law book. To be caught with a deer could mean hanging, blinding, or the chopping off of a hand. The lord's gamekeepers, often brutal and feared men, patrolled the woods with their dogs, ever watchful for the telltale signs of the poacher. The peasant's hunt was therefore a very different affair. It was a secret, silent, and highly skilled hunt for the small game, the humble creatures that lived in the margins, often beneath the notice of the lord and his keepers. This was the world of the snare and the trap. The master of this world was often the peasant himself, or his eldest son. The knowledge of the snare was passed down from father to son, a quiet and illicit inheritance. The materials were simple, a length of strong, thin cord, often made from twisted horsehair plucked from a horse's tail, and a sharp knife. The skill was in the knowledge of the animal's habits. The snarer knew the woods not as a collection of trees, but as a complex network of highways and paths. He knew the exact track that the rabbits used to travel from their warren to their feeding grounds. He knew the small tunnels in the undergrowth used by hares. He would set his snares in the grey, failing light of the evening. The snare was a simple, deadly efficient device, a running noose, propped open with small twigs and tied to a young springy sapling that was bent over under tension. When the rabbit passed through the loop, it would dislodge the trigger stick and the sapling would spring up, pulling the noose tight and killing the animal quickly and silently. He would set a line of these snares, his movements furtive and his senses alert for any sign of the gamekeeper. He would return to check his line in the absolute darkness, just before the dawn, the most secret time of the day. The walk through the frozen, silent woods would be one of heart-pounding anticipation. To find a snare empty was a quiet disappointment. To find it tripped, but the animal gone, was a frustration. But to find a rabbit, its body still warm, hanging limply in the noose, was a moment of pure, unadulterated, and triumphant joy. He would quickly reset the snare, hide the rabbit under his tunic, and hurry back to the hovel, his prize a secret treasure that would bring a rare and wonderful feast to his family. Birds were another target of the small hunt. In the depths of winter, large flocks of birds from the colder north, such as fieldfares and redwings, would descend upon the English countryside, stripping the hedgerows of their last berries. These birds were a welcome source of food. The peasant would use several ingenious methods to catch them. He might use a simple clapnet, 2 nets on a hinged frame that could be snapped shut over a flock of birds feeding on the ground. Or he would use birdlime, a fantastically sticky substance made by boiling the bark of the holly tree. He would smear this birdlime onto the branches of a berry bush. A bird, landing on the branch to feed, would find its feet hopelessly stuck and would be easily captured. These small birds, no bigger than a thrush, would be plucked, gutted, and roasted over the fire on a small spit, their tiny, fat-rich bodies, a delicious and savory treat. The small hunt was a high-stakes gamble. It was a constant game of cat and mouse with the Lord's authority. But the potential reward, a taste of fresh, rich meat, was a powerful incentive. The rabbit in the snare was more than just a meal. It was an act of defiance, a small and secret victory in the peasant's unending struggle for a small measure of control over his own survival. For those peasants who lived near a river, a lake, or a large pond, the coming of the deep freeze opened up a new and otherworldly landscape of opportunity. The frozen surface of the water, a solid, glittering highway of ice, offered access to the creatures that lived in the dark, cold world beneath. Ice fishing was another form of the bleak harvest, a pursuit that required immense patience, a tolerance for bitter cold, and a specialized set of skills. The first task was to breach the ice. With a heavy, broad-bladed axe, the fisherman would set to work, the rhythmic chunk of the axe on the thick ice echoing across the frozen landscape. This was hard, cold work. He would chop a hole a foot or 2 in diameter, sending shards of ice flying, until he broke through to the dark, shockingly cold water below. He would then employ one of several techniques. The simplest was the hand line. He would use a line made of twisted horsehair or hemp, with a small, baited hook carved from bone or a thorn. He would lie flat on the ice, his head and shoulders covered with a thick, dark woolen cloak to block out the glare of the winter sun on the ice. Peering down into the hole, his eyes would slowly adjust to the dim, green, underwater world. He would enter a state of deep, meditative patience, watching his baited hook as it dangled in the depths, waiting for the dark, predatory shape of a fish to emerge from the gloom. The target of this hunt was often the pike, a large and aggressive predator that remained active throughout the winter. To see the pike, to entice it to strike, and to pull its heavy, thrashing body up through the hole in the ice, was a moment of intense, primal excitement. Another technique involved a more active form of hunting. The fisherman would use a leister, a multi-pronged spear with barbed tines. He would lie by the hole, the leister held at the ready, and wait. When a fish, perhaps a large perch or a chub, drifted into view beneath the hole, he would strike with a single, swift, and powerful downward thrust, impaling the fish on the tines. This required a keen eye, a steady hand, and an instinctive understanding of the way the water refracted the light. The cold was a constant and brutal companion in this pursuit. The fisherman would be lying on the frozen surface for hours, the wind whipping across the open expanse of the river. He would be wrapped in every layer of woolen clothing he possessed, his hands and feet numb with the cold. But the potential reward was great. A single, large pike could feed his family for 2 or 3 days. The taste of its firm, white flesh, roasted over the embers of the hearth, was a clean, fresh, and almost miraculous contrast to the monotonous, salty flavor of the preserved food that dominated their diet. It was a taste of the wild, a gift from the frozen heart of the river, won through a combination of skill, endurance, and an almost zen-like patience. The bleak harvest, whether from the hedgerow, the woods, or the frozen river, was a testament to the peasants' profound and unsentimental intimacy with their environment. They knew its secrets, they understood its rhythms, and even in its most barren and hostile state, they knew how to wring from it the last, precious drops of life. As our long watch comes to a close, the deep and frozen night of the medieval winter begins, at last, to recede. A pale grey light begins to touch the horizon of our story, promising the eventual, miraculous return of the sun. For 10 hours, we have lived in the heart of that long darkness, and now we emerge with a new and profound understanding. We have huddled for warmth in the smoky, crowded, and living confines of the one-room hovel, a fortress of woven sticks and hardened mud that was both a sanctuary and a prison. We have sat by its central hearth, the living, breathing sun of its universe, feeling its life-giving heat and breathing its slow, choking poison. We have felt the icy tendrils of the wind as it probed the weaknesses of that fragile shelter, a constant reminder of the wild world held at bay. We have stood in the winter larder and understood the grim arithmetic of survival. We have seen the bounty of the harvest transformed through the ancient alchemy of salt, smoke, and fermentation into a monotonous but life-sustaining cache of preserved calories. We have tasted, in our imagination, the endless, communal, and perpetual pottage, a dish that was the very flavor of endurance. And we have walked the bleak, frozen landscape on the desperate hunt for the last, hidden morsels of the bleak harvest. The story of the medieval peasant's winter is a story of almost unimaginable hardship. It is a testament to a life lived on the very knife's edge of existence. But to see it only as a story of suffering is to miss the greater truth. It is, above all, a story of incredible, unbreakable resilience. Their survival was not an accident. It was an achievement of staggering proportions, a victory won every single day through a combination of intimate, encyclopedic knowledge of their environment, of ceaseless, back-breaking labor, and of a stubborn, communal refusal to be extinguished. The peasant was not a helpless victim of the winter. They were its expert adversary. They were the keepers of an ancient practical wisdom that we, in our heated and well-fed world, have almost entirely forgotten. The story of their winter is, in a profound way, our story. It is the story of the deep ancestral roots of our own survival, a reminder of the strength and ingenuity that is woven into the human spirit. It is a story that should leave us not with pity, but with a deep and abiding awe. And perhaps it can leave us with a new appreciation for the simple, unexamined miracles of our own lives. The solid walls that do not breathe the wind, the clean air in our lungs, the light that fills our rooms at the flick of a switch, and the profound, quiet luxury of a warm and private bed. Thank you for sharing this long and quiet vigil with us through the darkest season of the past. If these deep, immersive journeys into the very fabric of history bring you a sense of calm, of wonder, or of peace, we would be honored if you would subscribe to the channel. Your support makes these long explorations possible. As you now turn to your own rest, in your own warm and secure home, may you carry with you a small spark of that incredible, enduring human flame. May your sleep be deep, and your dreams be peaceful and warm.